The judge pointed at her like she was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "Take it off," he said. "Right now." She was 29 years old, standing in a federal courtroom in a military jacket stiff with dried blood, not her own, after 36 hours without sleep. Her hands were still trembling from the last patient she'd coded at 4 in the morning. She smelled like antiseptic and sweat and something darker that nobody in that courtroom could name. The gallery laughed. They didn't know what was under that jacket. Nobody in that room did. And the moment she refused to take it off, the moment her eyes went flat and cold and completely unreadable, the temperature in that courtroom dropped by 10 degrees. If this story already has you locked in, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go. Bessie. The morning had started the way most of Emily Hartwell's mornings started. Not with sleep ending naturally, but with someone cutting it short. Her phone went off at 3:47 a.m. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot in the on-call room at Kessler Regional Medical Center, lacing up her boots. She'd been awake for 22 hours at that point, the kind of awake that stops feeling like anything, where your body just runs on muscle memory and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided at some very fundamental level that stopping is not an option. The charge nurse's voice on the other end was tight. "MVC inbound, 2 critical, 1 pediatric." "I'm up," Emily said. She was already moving. The ER at Kessler Regional looked like a war zone by 5 a.m. That wasn't a metaphor she used lightly. She'd seen actual war zones. This had the same quality of organized chaos, the same noise, the same compressed urgency, the same sense that every single decision carried weight. Except here, nobody was shooting at her. That was a meaningful improvement. The pediatric patient was 7 years old. Emily didn't let herself think about that while she worked. She thought about airway, breathing, circulation. She thought about the internal bleed the ultrasound was showing. She thought about the next 60 seconds, not the next 60 minutes. That was how you stayed functional. That was how you kept a 7-year-old alive while your hands were covered in blood and the attending was yelling for a second large-bore IV and the mother was screaming something in the hallway that Emily couldn't afford to hear right now. The kid made it. So did the adults. By 6:30 a.m., Emily was standing at the nurse's station writing documentation with the mechanical focus of someone running on fumes. Her jacket, the old military-issue field jacket she'd had for years, faded olive green with a small embroidered patch on the left shoulder, was hung on the back of her chair. She put it back on without thinking about it. It was just something she wore, had worn so long it felt like a second skin. Hartwell. That was Priya, the day charge nurse, appearing at her elbow with a tablet and the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "You've got court at 9. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I know." "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't slept." "You want someone to cover the testimony? We can probably get Dr. Osei to—" "No." Emily pulled her jacket straight and started gathering her notes. "I'll be there." Priya gave her a look that said, "You're going to show up to federal court covered in blood." And Emily gave her a look back that said, "Yes, and that was the end of that conversation. The Harmon County Federal Courthouse sat in the middle of downtown Callaway like something that had been there forever and intended to stay. Gray stone, wide steps, the kind of building that communicated institutional permanence whether you liked it or not. Emily took the stairs fast, still in her scrubs under the field jacket, her ID badge clipped to the pocket, her hair pulled back in a way that had been neat 12 hours ago and wasn't anymore. She was 6 minutes late. She didn't apologize for it. The courtroom was already in session. She slipped in through the side door and caught the eye of the defense attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Delgado, who had called Emily 3 weeks ago asking if she'd be willing to testify as a medical witness. Emily had said yes. She'd met the defendant once, and that had been enough. His name was Nate Rourke. He was 26, a former Navy corpsman who had done 2 deployments and come home to a city that had largely stopped caring about what that meant. He was currently charged with felony assault, 3 counts, against 3 men who had filed statements describing him as a violent, unstable veteran who had attacked them without provocation outside a restaurant on Meridian Street 4 months ago. Emily had read every page of the case file, twice. She settled into the seat Delgado had held for her and assessed the room in the way she always did, automatically, without deciding to. Old habit. The judge was a man named Forsyth, mid-60s, with the bearing of someone who had been obeyed for so long he'd forgotten other arrangements were possible. The prosecution table was occupied by a pair of attorneys who had the polished, well-rested look of people with good funding. Nate sat beside Delgado looking like a man trying very hard to be invisible, shoulders in, eyes down, his hands flat on the table like he was consciously keeping them still. The three alleged victims sat in the gallery. Emily had looked up their names when she'd first gotten the case file. The one who had filed the most detailed statement, a man named Gareth Paulson, was the 32-year-old son of Victor Paulson, a commercial real estate developer who had significant interests in Callaway's downtown corridor. He was sitting in the second row with the kind of confident stillness that comes from knowing the room is already inclined toward you. Emily looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away. The testimony before hers ran long. A forensic analyst. A responding officer. The prosecution's medical expert, a smooth-spoken hospitalist who managed to describe Nate's intervention that night as disproportionate force in a way that sounded almost reasonable if you didn't know what you were looking at. Emily knew what she was looking at. Her turn came just before 11. She walked to the stand and gave her name and credentials. Registered nurse, 13 years combined experience including 6 years in emergency and trauma care, currently a senior trauma nurse at Kessler Regional. She left certain other parts of her resume out. She always did. That wasn't what she was here for. The direct examination went fine. Delgado had prepared her well. Emily walked through the medical evidence methodically. The injury pattern on the alleged victim, the mechanics of the technique Nate had used to stop him, the emergency procedure Nate had performed immediately after. She kept her voice level and her language precise. She didn't embellish. She didn't have to. Then it was the prosecution's turn. The lead prosecutor's name was Whitmore. He was good, practiced, composed, the kind of cross-examiner who understood that the goal wasn't to win an argument, but to make the witness look unreliable. He started gently, prodding at the edges of Emily's qualifications, suggesting that trauma nursing and combat medicine were different disciplines, that her conclusions were speculative. Emily answered each question with the same measured calm. She'd been cross-examined before. She'd been questioned by people in significantly higher stakes situations than this one. And then Forsyth leaned forward. He'd been watching her since she sat down. She'd noticed, she always noticed, but she hadn't flagged it. Judges looked at witnesses. That was normal. But the way he was looking at her wasn't quite normal. "Ms. Hartwell," he said. His voice had a particular quality to it, the judicial equivalent of talking down to a child while performing the appearance of fairness. "I'm going to ask you to remove that jacket." The room went quiet. Emily looked at him. "Your Honor?" "The jacket." He gestured with 2 fingers, the way you gesture at something you found mildly offensive. "You're in a federal courtroom. That is not appropriate attire for this setting." She was wearing clean scrubs under the jacket. The jacket itself had seen better days. It was old, faded, soft from years of wear, but there was nothing inappropriate about it by any reasonable standard. The patch on the shoulder was small. She'd had it so long she sometimes forgot it was there. "I'd prefer to keep it on," she said. Forsyth's expression shifted. Something tightened around his eyes. "That wasn't a request." Emily held his gaze. She was very, very tired. She had been awake for 31 hours. She had watched a 7-year-old almost die 5 hours ago and had not let herself fully feel that yet because she couldn't afford to. She had driven 40 minutes to this courthouse to tell the truth about a young man whose entire future was being dismantled by people with money and influence and zero compunction about using both. And she was being told to take off a jacket. "Your Honor," Delgado said, rising carefully. "My client's witness. Counselor." Forsyth didn't look at her. He was still looking at Emily. "Your witness appears to have come to my courtroom dressed as if she just rolled out of a barracks. If she wants to continue testifying, she will follow this court's standards of professional dress." Something in the gallery shifted. A few people looked at each other. A few people were already smiling. "What is that anyway?" Forsyth said, nodding toward her shoulder. His tone had moved from judicial to something else, something with an edge of performance to it. like he'd decided the room needed a little entertainment. Some kind of patch? What unit is that supposed to be from? Snickers from the gallery. Not many, but enough. Emily heard them. She kept her face still. I'll ask you one more time, Forsyth said. Remove the jacket, or I will hold you in contempt of this court and have you removed from these proceedings. Is that clear? The room was very quiet. Emily's hands rested on the railing of the witness stand. She could feel the edge of the wood under her palms. She could feel the weight of the jacket on her shoulders, familiar, constant, an anchor she had carried through places and circumstances that this room could not begin to imagine. She looked at Forsyth. She looked at the gallery, the polished Paulson kid with his comfortable expression, the prosecution team with their neat folders, the reporters in the back row whose phones were already out. She looked at Nate Rourke, who was watching her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a person who has decided that no one is coming, who has braced for one more thing going wrong. She didn't take the jacket off. I heard you, she said. The hallway outside Courtroom 4 had the particular silence of institutional spaces during working hours. Fluorescent hum, distant footsteps, the muffled sound of proceedings behind closed doors. Emily sat on a bench outside, not because she'd been removed from the stand yet, but because Forsyth had called a 15-minute recess after her refusal, and the bailiff had suggested she wait outside. She was staring at the floor, not thinking about anything specific. That was a skill, too. Emptying your head between rounds. Let the body rest, even if the eyes stayed open. The double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Even without looking up, something in the cadence of them registered. Precise, unhurried, carrying authority not through aggression, but through sheer certainty of purpose. Military bearing, she'd recognize it anywhere because it was the same thing she'd spent years unlearning in her own walk. She looked up. The man coming toward her was in his late 50s. He wore civilian clothes, a dark suit, no tie, good shoes, but his posture told a complete story. Behind him, two younger men in suits kept pace, moving with the coordinated awareness of people who were always watching the room. He was 20 feet away when he saw the patch. He stopped. Not a stumble. Not a fumble. A controlled, complete stop, the way a military man stops, on command. His eyes had locked onto her shoulder and stayed there. And something had happened in his expression that Emily couldn't fully read from 20 feet, but that made the back of her neck prickle. He started walking again, slower now. She watched him come. He stopped 4 feet from her bench and looked at the patch for another 3 seconds. Then he looked at her face, then back at the patch. "What unit?" he said. His voice was quiet. The two men behind him stopped walking. Emily looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry?" "The call sign." He pointed a small, precise gesture. "On your shoulder. What unit?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she'd been trained to read a situation fast. His eyes were gray and steady, and held the particular quality of a person who had spent a significant portion of their life responsible for other people's lives. "You're going to need to tell me who you're asking," she said. Something moved through his expression. It might have been recognition. It might have been something older and more complicated than that. "My name is Colonel James Thatcher," he said. "Joint Special Operations Command, retired. Currently serving as a federal liaison for military justice matters." A beat. "And I'm asking because that call sign belongs to an asset whose file I spent 6 months trying to read and was told didn't exist." The hallway was very quiet. Emily's hands were still in her lap. She looked at the floor for a second, then back up at him. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I know what you are now," Thatcher said. "I'm asking what you were, Bomb." She didn't answer him. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door and told her the recess was ending, and Emily stood up and smoothed her jacket and walked back inside without looking at Thatcher again. She could feel him watching her go. Back on the stand, Forsyth had recomposed himself into the full authority of his office. The gallery had resettled. The prosecution team was ready. Nate Rourke was still sitting the same way he'd been sitting before, some careful, contained, like a man holding himself very still so nothing else could go wrong. Ms. Hartwell, Forsyth said. Have you reconsidered? I have not, Emily said. The gallery murmured. Someone laughed. A short, incredulous sound, like they couldn't believe she was still doing this. Forsyth leaned back. He had the look of a man who was going to make a decision and enjoy making it. Let me ask you something, he said, and the performance was back in his voice. That patch on your shoulder, is that from some kind of what? A recreational group? A club? The laughter in the gallery was clearer this time, more of it. Because it doesn't look like any official military insignia I recognize, Forsyth continued. And I've been a federal judge for 19 years. I've seen a few. Emily looked at him. Her expression had not changed. It looks, he said, tilting his head, like something someone sewed on themselves. A costume piece. He let that land. Are you a veteran, Ms. Hartwell? Is that what this is about? Some kind of, Your Honor. Delgado was on her feet. Theatrical statement about, Your Honor, this line of questioning is... The courtroom doors opened. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just opened. The way doors open when someone has decided they're going through them. But the sound was enough. The soft mechanical thud of the push bar, the shift in air pressure, and something about the way it happened made the room turn. Colonel James Thatcher walked in. Behind him were two men Emily hadn't seen in the hallway. In uniform this time. Not dress uniforms, the kind that meant working hours, not ceremony. Their posture made the bailiff near the door instinctively step back without appearing to realize he'd done it. Forsyth stared. This is a closed proceeding. You cannot... Judge Forsyth. Thatcher's voice wasn't loud. He didn't need volume. I apologize for the interruption. I'll keep this brief. You absolutely cannot walk into my name is Colonel James Thatcher, JSOC, currently operating under Federal Liaison Authority. He reached into his jacket, produced a credential card, and held it up. Long enough for Forsyth to see, not long enough to be theatrical about it. I need 2 minutes of this court's time. After that, you can throw me out if you'd like. The room was absolutely still. Forsyth's jaw was tight. He looked at the credential. He looked at the two uniformed men by the door. He looked at the gallery, which was looking back at him, and Emily could see the calculation happening in real time. The political weight of the room, the cameras in the back, the decision about what was smarter. 2 minutes, Forsyth said. Thatcher walked forward until he was in the open space between the gallery and the bench. He didn't look at the prosecution table. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked at Emily, who was still on the witness stand, and when their eyes met, she felt the precise, cold clarity of a person who is about to be seen. The individual you've been speaking to, Thatcher said, and his voice was level, no performance, no theater, just facts, is not simply an emergency room nurse. I don't see what's relevant. What's relevant, Your Honor, is that you've spent the last hour inviting this courtroom to mock a woman for wearing a piece of military insignia that most people in this building don't have the clearance to know exists. Thatcher paused. He looked at the patch on Emily's shoulder. That call sign, the one you called a costume piece, belongs to a classified special operations medical unit. The specific designation on her jacket corresponds to an active duty file that is under federal classification. Dead silence. The asset operating under that designation, Thatcher continued, received 2 classified commendations and 1 formal military decoration during operations that this court does not have the clearance to hear described. She was medically separated from service after sustaining injuries in a combat engagement. The nature of those injuries, that's enough, Emily said. Her voice was quiet. The room turned toward her. Her expression hadn't shifted. Still the same flat, controlled stillness she'd been wearing for the past hour, but something had changed around her eyes. Something that looked a lot like a door closing. Colonel, she said, I appreciate you being here. Thatcher looked at her. He understood. Of course. Emily looked at Forsyth. Forsyth was a different person than he'd been 5 minutes ago. Not a changed person, just exposed. The confident gravity of his office was still there in the structure of his face, but something had drained out of it. He was sitting very still. You wanted me to take the jacket off, Emily said. Her hands moved to the front zipper. The room held its breath. She unzipped it slowly, slid it off her shoulders, held it folded across her arms. The short sleeves of her scrub top left both arms fully visible. The gallery didn't laugh this time. What covered Emily Hartwell's arms from the mid-forearm up, continuing as the neckline of her scrubs revealed across her shoulders and collarbone, was not the unmarked skin of someone who had spent 13 years in emergency nursing. It was a landscape. Burn scarring across the right forearm, surgical graft lines visible at the edges, pale and ridged against her natural skin tone. A lateral scar along the left bicep, thick enough to be structural rather than incidental. At the base of her neck on the right side, 3 parallel marks that anybody who knew what they were looking at would recognize as shrapnel entry points. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Nate Rourke was looking at her with an expression she hadn't let herself read until this moment, and what was in it was something she recognized. The particular sorrow of one person who has been in the dark places recognizing another. Forsyth had stopped moving entirely. Thatcher stood straight, and then, in the silence of Courtroom 4 in the Harmon County Federal Courthouse, on a Tuesday morning in November, he brought his right hand up in a salute. "It is an honor, Phantom 9, he said. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the jacket in her arms. Then she looked at Forsyth. And what was in her eyes when she did was not triumph. It was not anger. It was not even satisfaction. It was the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of a person who has never needed the room to know who she was, and is only here because someone else needed her. "Now," she said, "if the court is finished—" She set the jacket over the railing of the witness stand with the patch facing out. "I'd like to get back to the reason I drove 40 minutes to be here." She sat back down. The room didn't move. "Mr. Whitmore," Emily said, looking at the prosecutor with the same professional calm she'd had before any of this started. "I believe you were in the middle of a question." Whitmore looked at his notes. He looked at his co-counsel. He looked like a man recalibrating very quickly. In the second row of the gallery, Gareth Paulson had stopped leaning back. His arms, which had been crossed with comfortable certainty for the past 2 hours, were now down at his sides. He was looking at Emily with an expression she'd seen on very different kinds of faces in very different settings. The expression of a person who has just realized at a cellular level that the situation is no longer what they thought it was. Emily filed that away. She didn't let it show on her face. She turned back to the stand and waited, because she still had testimony to give. And in that testimony, she carried something far more dangerous to Gareth Paulson and his father than any military record. She carried the truth about what happened on Meridian Street, and she had the documents to prove it. Whitmore sat with his pen hovering over his legal pad for exactly 3 seconds too long. The whole room noticed. He was good at his job. Emily had already established that. But good at his job meant he'd spent the past 2 hours operating inside a set of assumptions that had just been surgically removed. And now he was doing the thing people do when the ground shifts, buying time while the recalibration runs. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, and to his credit, his voice had mostly recovered. "You've testified that the technique used by the defendant on Mr. Paulson was, your word, appropriate. I'd like to revisit that characterization." "Go ahead," Emily said. "You described it as a vascular restraint hold, a technique typically associated with law enforcement and military close protection training." "Yes, but the defendant is not a law enforcement officer. He's a former Navy corpsman with 2 combat deployments and tactical combat casualty care certification. The technique is taught in that training pipeline." Whitmore nodded slowly, like he was absorbing a useful point rather than losing ground. The outcome, however, was that Gareth Paulson suffered a fractured orbital socket and a cervical strain, 2 injuries serious enough to require hospitalization. The orbital fracture resulted from Mr. Paulson striking the pavement when he lost consciousness, Emily said. The cervical strain is consistent with that same fall mechanism. Neither injury was caused by the hold itself. You're certain of that? I'm certain of the biomechanics involved, yes. Based on reviewing records. Based on 13 years of treating trauma injuries and a working knowledge of how this particular hold functions anatomically. The hold compresses the carotid arteries bilaterally. It doesn't torque the neck. If Mr. Rourke had applied cervical torque, we'd be talking about a very different injury profile. Whitmore's pen moved. He wrote something, though Emily suspected it was less about notes and more about buying himself another second. In the gallery, Gareth Paulson had gone very still. "Let's talk about what you claim to have reviewed," Whitmore said. "You mentioned medical records, security footage, a chain of custody document. These were provided to you by defense counsel?" "Some of them. Some I requested independently through the hospital's medical records division." "You requested them independently?" A beat. "On whose authority?" "My own. I'm a licensed medical professional. I can request records relevant to a case in which I'm serving as a medical witness. That's standard practice." "Ms. Hartwell, the prosecution has reviewed the evidence list in this case extensively. We're not aware of any chain of custody documentation that wasn't already part of the record." Emily looked at him. "Then you're about to become aware of it." Whitmore paused. He looked at his co-counsel, a younger woman whose expression had developed a faint crease of concern. Then he looked back at Emily. "Could you elaborate?" he said, and the practiced smoothness in his voice had developed a hairline fracture. "There's a set of medical intake records from Callaway General's emergency department, the night of the Meridian Street incident. Specifically records pertaining to a third-party patient who was treated that same night. Those records were not included in the original evidence disclosure." "That's a serious allegation, Ms. Hartwell." "I'm not alleging anything yet. I'm telling you what exists." Forsyth, who had been sitting with unusual quietness since Emily put her jacket back on, now leaned forward. "Counselor," he said to Whitmore, "do you have knowledge of records that were not disclosed?" "Your Honor, Whitmore looked genuinely uncertain for the first time. "I would need to review what the witness is referencing before I can speak to that." "Then I'd suggest you find out quickly," Forsyth said. His voice had changed. Some of the judicial performance had flattened out of it, replaced by something more careful, something that recognized, Emily thought, that the room had shifted beneath all of them. "We'll recess for lunch. We'll reconvene at 1:30, at which point Ms. Hartwell will have the opportunity to submit whatever documentation she's referencing through proper evidentiary channels." He brought the gavel down. One clean, firm knock. The room began to move. Delgado caught Emily's arm before she'd made it 2 steps from the stand. "What records?" she said. Her voice was low, pressed close. The kind of voice that meant, "I'm your attorney, and you just said something in open court that I need to know about right now." "I'll explain at lunch," Emily said. "You'll explain right now." "Delgado, I have to eat something or I'm going to fall over, and that's not an exaggeration." Emily looked at her steadily. "Give me 20 minutes and a sandwich, and I will walk you through every document. I've had them for 2 weeks. Delgado's expression moved through several things rapidly. Frustration, calculation, something that might have been relief underneath the irritation. "You had them for 2 weeks and didn't tell me?" "I tried to tell you. You were at a conference in Portland." "I have a phone." "You also have a paralegal who screens your calls and decided a nurse's message about medical records wasn't urgent." Emily picked up this jacket from the railing and put it back on. The patch faced outward. 20 minutes. Delgado let go of her arm. "Conference room B, down the hall, second left." She was already reaching for her phone. "I'll have someone bring food." Emily was halfway to the door when she heard her name, not called out, but said, quiet enough that it was meant only for her. Nate Rourke was standing near the defense table. The bailiff was a few feet away, close enough to require that they keep it short. He was looking at Emily with an expression she hadn't fully let herself read until now, because reading it would cost her something, and she hadn't had the reserves for it earlier. He was 26 years old. He had the weathered quality of someone who had been places that put years on a person. His hands, which she'd noticed during her earlier review of the case, because she noticed hands, because hands told you what a person knew how to do, were steady. He had a corpsman's hands. She recognized them. "You didn't have to come back in," he said. "I said I'd testify." After... He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "After all that, you still came back in." Emily looked at him. She thought about the 7-year-old she'd stabilized at 4 in the morning. She thought about the 40-minute drive and the jacket and Forsyth's voice saying costume piece to a courtroom full of people who'd found it funny. "You stopped an assault," she said, "and then you performed an emergency intervention on the person you'd just been forced to subdue. That's not a violent man. That's a trained one." She paused. "The least I can do is tell the truth about it." Nate didn't say anything for a moment. The bailiff was shifting his weight. Time was short. "The records you mentioned," Nate said. "The ones they don't know about." "Yeah." "Is it enough?" Emily held his gaze. "Finish the afternoon session and see." She walked out. Conference room B had a long table, bad overhead lighting, and a view of a parking structure. Delgado arrived 3 minutes after Emily with a paralegal named Marcus, who set down a bag of food from somewhere nearby and then left quickly, reading the room accurately. Emily ate half a turkey sandwich in 4 bites, which was less about hunger and more about having learned in various contexts that food was fuel and fuel was functional, and the aesthetics of eating didn't matter when there was work to do. Then she pulled out a file folder. Delgado sat across from her and opened it. It took her about 90 seconds to read the first document. She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Callaway General's medical records. Third-party patient intake. The night of the Meridian Street incident, specifically 11:47 p.m., 40 minutes before Nate's interaction with Paulson and the others." Emily turned the document so Delgado could see it more clearly. A young woman was admitted to Callaway General's ER that night. Acute soft tissue trauma, laceration to the left forearm, contusion to the face, presenting with acute stress response. Delgado's eyes moved across the page. A waitress. Her name's in the file. She was working a private event at a restaurant on Meridian, the same restaurant Paulson and his group had dinner at that night. She checked herself into the ER at 11:47 and was treated and released. She gave a statement to the intake nurse that she had been, and I'm quoting the intake note, grabbed and cornered by a group of men outside the restaurant service exit. Delgado was very quiet. "That intake note," Emily continued, "is dated 4 months ago, before this case went to trial, before charges were filed." She let that sit for a second. "It was not included in the prosecution's evidence disclosure. They may not have known. They knew." Emily's voice stayed level. "Because that same intake note references a police interaction log, a responding officer who attended the ER that night and took a brief statement from the victim. That log would have been generated within the CAPD system. The same CAPD system that generated the incident report from Meridian Street. Both files would have been discoverable by any competent investigation." Delgado set the document down. She picked up the next one. Her expression had shifted into something that Emily recognized as controlled and precise. A lawyer who has found something real and is processing what it means strategically, not emotionally. "The officer who responded," Delgado said. "Officer T. Wren, badge number in the log. She filed a supplemental report. That supplemental report was also not disclosed." "How did you get this?" "The victim's name is in the intake file. I contacted Callaway General's patient liaison office under my role as medical witness for this case and requested corroborating medical records. They're permitted to release them to authorized legal medical witnesses with signed patient consent." Emily looked at her. "I called the victim directly. Her name is Mara Solano. She's 23 years old, and she's been terrified to come forward because she received a call from a legal representative of Victor Paulson's development group 2 weeks after the incident, informing her that she had no legal standing to make allegations about a private event." Delgado was very still. "She's signed the consent form. I have it with me." Emily slid it across the table. "She's also willing to testify. She's been willing to testify for 4 months. Nobody asked her." The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. "Emily," Delgado said, and it was the first time she'd used her first name. "If the prosecution knew about Mara Solano and suppressed, I'm not saying who suppressed what. That's not my job." Emily finished the last of the sandwich. "My job was to tell the truth about Nate Rourke's actions from a medical perspective. The records are what they are. What you do with them is your business." Delgado picked up the file and held it like it had weight, because it did. 1:30, she said. I'll be ready, Emily said. Guys. The afternoon session reconvened with a different atmosphere than the morning had left. Word had moved through the building the way word always moves in closed institutional spaces, imperfectly, in pieces, with enough accuracy to shift the temperature. 2 reporters who hadn't been in the gallery that morning were now sitting in the back. Forsyth had arrived at the bench looking like a man who had spent his lunch hour on the phone. Thatcher was in the gallery. He'd taken a seat in the far left aisle, and he sat with the stillness of a person accustomed to waiting rooms and observation posts and long silences. He wasn't looking at Emily. He was watching the prosecution table. The evidence submission process took 40 minutes. Delgado moved through it with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been building to this for 3 weeks and was not going to rush the last 50 yards. Emily submitted each document formally, explained the sourcing and chain of custody in clear, non-technical language, and answered Forsyth's questions, which had become noticeably more precise and considerably less theatrical, with the same flat professionalism she'd maintained all day. When Mara Solano's intake record went into evidence, a sound moved through the gallery. Not loud, just present. When Officer Wren's supplemental report followed it, Whitmore asked to approach the bench. The sidebar lasted 11 minutes. Emily sat on the stand and studied the grain of the wooden railing in front of her. She was running on the last of her reserves now, could feel it in the specific way her perception had narrowed, the way the room had taken on that slightly overexposed quality of extreme fatigue. She had a system for this. You acknowledged the state of your body, you cataloged what was still functional, and you didn't ask anything of yourself that wasn't strictly necessary. Her hands were still steady. Her voice was still clear. That was what mattered. The sidebar ended. Whitmore walked back to his table and sat down. He and his co-counsel exchanged 3 words, low enough that Emily couldn't read them. Then the co-counsel stood up. Your Honor, she said, the prosecution would like to request a continuance to review newly submitted evidence. The gallery murmured. Denied, Forsyth said. His voice was dry and precise. The documentation has been properly submitted and sourced. We proceed. He looked at Whitmore. Do you have further cross-examination for this witness? A pause. No, Your Honor, Whitmore said. Forsyth nodded. He looked at Emily. He held her gaze for exactly as long as it took for something to pass between them that wasn't an apology, and wasn't forgiveness, and wasn't anything as clean as either of those things. Just acknowledgement. Just the bare fact of what had happened in this room and who had been there for it. You may step down, he said. Emily stood. She picked up the jacket. She put it on. She walked back to the gallery and sat beside Delgado without looking at anyone else. Delgado said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. The afternoon was still moving. Delgado's closing argument was 45 minutes. Emily had heard good closings before. In courtrooms, in field debriefs, in the particular genre of military after-action review where someone had to construct a coherent narrative out of chaos and convince a room full of exhausted, skeptical people to see it the same way. Delgado was good. She was the kind of good that came from caring about the outcome, not just the performance of caring. She walked the jury through the Meridian Street incident in the sequence it actually happened, as the evidence now showed it. Mara Solano leaving through the service exit, the men following her, one of them producing a knife, a fact that had been sitting in a police inventory log that the prosecution had also not disclosed, and which Forsyth's expression upon its introduction had been something Emily decided not to observe too closely. Nate Rourke, coming around the corner of the building at 12:31 a.m., assessing the situation in the time it takes a trained person to assess a situation, intervening, and then, this was the part Delgado slowed down for, performing a pressure point intervention on the injured man's neck laceration while they waited for the ambulance, using his corpsman training to keep a man alive, a man who, minutes earlier, had been holding a knife on a 23-year-old woman. Nate Rourke, Delgado said, near the end, did not attack 3 innocent men. He stopped an assault, and then he kept one of those men from bleeding out on a sidewalk. and then he sat with his hands visible and waited for the police to arrive because that is what a trained, disciplined person does when the immediate threat is over. She paused. The question before you is not complicated. It never was. The jury went out at 4:15. Emily sat in the gallery and let herself be still for the first time all day. She was aware of Thatcher 3 rows behind her and to the left. She was aware of the prosecution team at their table, doing the particular kind of busy work that lawyers do when there is nothing to do but wait. She was aware of Nate at the defense table, sitting with his hands flat on the surface again, eyes straight ahead. She thought about Mara Solano, 23 years old, working a restaurant job, walking out a service exit, a phone call from a lawyer 2 weeks later telling her she had no legal standing. She thought about the 7-year-old from this morning who was upstairs in the PICU right now, stable, with a long road ahead of her. Who would wake up tomorrow not knowing that a nurse with shaking hands and 36 hours of sleep debt had made a series of correct decisions at 4 in the morning that gave her the chance to have a tomorrow? None of it was clean. None of it was the version of justice that looked good in a movie. The version where the truth lands perfectly and everyone sees it in real time and the consequences are immediate and proportionate. Real justice was grubby. It was 45-minute closings and 11-minute sidebars and a stack of medical records that had existed for 4 months while a young man's life got systematically dismantled. But sometimes the records got into evidence. Sometimes the jury went out. Sometimes that was enough. The jury came back in 1 hour and 40 minutes. That was fast. Emily knew what fast meant in jury deliberations, and she let herself feel the edge of something. Not hope exactly, more like the particular alertness of a person who has prepared for multiple outcomes and is now narrowing down the probability field. The foreperson was a woman in her 50s. She stood with the particular composure of someone who had been sitting in a room full of disagreement and had arrived at certainty anyway. On the charge of felony assault in the first degree against Gareth Paulson, not guilty. The sound from the gallery was immediate. Emily didn't look around. She watched Nate. On the charge of felony assault in the second degree against Marcus Dupree, not guilty. Nate's hands, flat on the table, still. On the charge of felony assault in the second degree against Ross Kellerman, not guilty. And then, only then, did his hands move. He put them over his face just for a second, just long enough to be a person, and then he brought them back down and was composed again, because that was the training, and you didn't stop carrying it just because the room was safe. Delgado put her hand on his arm. Forsyth waited for the room to settle. He looked out at the gallery, then at the prosecution table, then, and this was deliberate, Emily thought, at the area where Gareth Paulson had been sitting. Gareth Paulson was still there. He hadn't moved since the jury walked in. His expression had the frozen quality of a person whose internal calculations have stopped producing usable results. All charges against the defendant are dismissed, Forsyth said. Mr. Rourke, you're free to go. A pause, briefer than Emily expected, but present. The court will also note, for the record, that questions regarding the completeness of the original evidence disclosure in this matter have been referred to the Harmon County District Attorney's Office for review. That was quiet. That was surgical. And from across the room, Emily watched Gareth Paulson understand what it meant. The courthouse steps in the late afternoon light had the drained post-event quality of somewhere that had held something significant and was now returning to normal. Emily sat on the low stone wall at the base of the steps, jacket on, her bag beside her, watching the city go about its business with complete indifference to what had just happened inside. She was so tired she could feel it in her back teeth, that particular fatigue that had moved past physical discomfort into something more structural. The fatigue of having been at maximum capacity for a very long time and not having a clear stopping point on the horizon. Her phone had 6 missed calls from Kessler Regional. She'd deal with those in a minute. That was well done. Thatcher. He came down the steps and stopped a few feet from her, hands in his jacket pockets. He was alone. The 2 uniformed men had gone. Emily looked at him. You didn't need to do any of that, she said. No, he agreed. I didn't. It wasn't a request. Also correct. He seemed unbothered by this. I was in the building for a different matter. I saw the patch. I made a decision. A pause. I'd make the same one again. Emily looked back out at the street. A bus went by, 2 kids on bikes, a delivery truck double parked near the corner. "What do you want, Colonel?" she said. "At the moment?" "Nothing." He sat down on the wall a few feet from her with the easy directness of someone who doesn't waste energy on hovering. "You should know that what happened in that courtroom this afternoon is going to generate some noise. The referral to the DA's office, that's going to pull threads." "I know." Victor Paulson has connections to 3 members of the county commissioner's board. His development group has contracts with 2 municipal departments. When people like that start getting investigated, they look for pressure points. Emily looked at him. "Are you warning me?" "Informing you," Thatcher said. "There's a difference." "Not always." He acknowledged that with a small nod. "The file on Phantom 9 is classified, but the existence of that call sign is now in a federal court record. That's not something that can be quietly managed." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about that, about what it meant for the particular privacy she had built around herself in the years since, the clean separation between what she'd been and what she was now, the deliberate smallness of her daily life, the morning shifts and the coded pediatric patients and the on-call cot and the 40-minute drives. "My patients still need me," she said. Thatcher looked at her sideways. "That's all?" "That's all." He was quiet for a moment, then, "There's a training program, JSOC Medical Integration. We've been developing a curriculum for forward-deployed medics, specifically the kind of rapid trauma decision-making your unit pioneered. There's a faculty position." He said it without pressure, the way you mention a thing because it's true rather than because you're selling it. In case you wanted to know, it existed. Emily looked at her hands. The scarring on her right arm caught the afternoon light. She'd stopped noticing it most days. "I appreciate that," she said. "But," Thatcher said, "but nothing. I said I appreciated it." She stood up, picked up her bag. "I have 6 missed calls from my hospital, and I'm already 4 hours past the end of my shift." Thatcher stood as well. He was quiet for a moment. Then he held out his hand. She shook it. "The record still exists," he said. "What you did over there. It doesn't disappear because you decided to be a nurse." Emily looked at him for a moment. Something in that landed in a place she'd sealed off for a long time. Not painfully, just with the dull, specific weight of something true. "I know," she said. "That's not why I became a nurse." She walked down the sidewalk toward the parking structure. The city moved around her. Taxis, a food cart, 2 men in suits arguing outside a building, all of it completely indifferent. She was almost to the corner when her phone rang again. Not Kessler Regional this time. A number she didn't recognize. Callaway area code. She stopped walking, looked at it. She answered. "Ms. Hartwell." The voice on the other end was male, professional, with the very careful neutrality of a man accustomed to delivering messages for other people. "My name is Alan Briggs. I represent Victor Paulson's legal interests. I understand you were involved in today's proceedings." "I testified," Emily said. "Yes." A pause. "Mr. Paulson wanted me to convey that he has significant respect for your service. He would also like to discuss—" "Mr. Briggs," Emily said. "Yes?" "I know what a call like this is. I know what it's offering and what it's not saying." She looked at the corner of the street, watched the light change. "Tell your client that his son was in that courtroom today. He saw what the evidence showed. He knows what happened on Meridian Street." She paused. "And tell him the DA's referral runs on its own schedule now. There's nothing to discuss." A beat of silence. "Ms. Hartwell," Briggs said, and the professional neutrality had thinned slightly. "I want to be clear that Mr. Paulson's position in this city is— I know what his position is." Her voice was very calm. "I'm a trauma nurse in this city. I've worked a night shift in his zip code. I've coded his neighbors." She let that sit. "Good night, Mr. Briggs." She ended the call. The light had changed. She crossed the street. Behind her in the courthouse parking lot, a man in a gray sedan sat with his phone to his ear. She wouldn't have noticed him. There was no reason to notice a man in a gray sedan in a courthouse parking lot. He looked from the outside like anyone, but his call had already ended. And he wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at the woman crossing the street at the far corner. And then he was reaching into the glove compartment. Emily made it to the parking structure entrance, pressed the elevator call button, and waited. The city noise filled the space around her. Engines, voices, the mechanical clunk of the structure above her head. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors started to close. Through the narrowing gap, she caught a half-second glimpse of the man from the gray sedan, 30 yards away, walking fast toward the parking structure entrance with something in his hand and the very specific, purposeful quality of a person who is moving toward a location rather than through it. The doors closed. The elevator rose. Emily stood in the elevator and looked straight ahead and did not let her face do anything. But her right hand was already moving to her bag, the one with her hospital ID, her keys, her phone, and the thumb drive she hadn't submitted to the court because it wasn't part of what the court needed. The thumb drive that contained the complete set of records, not just the intake note and the supplemental report. Every document she had pulled from every source over the past 3 weeks, including 2 files that she had not shown Delgado, because Delgado hadn't needed them to win the case. But someone, apparently, had decided she needed to not have them. The elevator reached level 3. The doors opened. Emily walked out. Her footsteps were even. Her breathing was controlled. She was 37 hours without sleep and moving through a parking structure on pure training and the very specific clarity that comes when all the noise cuts out and only the necessary information remains. She found her car, got in, locked the door. Through the windshield, she could see the stairwell door at the far end of the level. Closed. Not yet open. She had maybe 90 seconds. She pulled out the thumb drive, looked at it, thought about the 2 files she hadn't submitted, the ones that didn't just show what Gareth Paulson had done that night on Meridian Street, the ones that showed what Victor Paulson had done the morning after when he'd made 3 phone calls to specific numbers, and those phone calls had produced specific outcomes in the way the evidence was filed and handled, and the way a 23-year-old woman had received a legal warning she had no means to contest. Emily plugged the thumb drive into her phone, opened the encrypted folder, forwarded both files to 3 separate email addresses. Delgado's personal account, a federal court records inbox she'd looked up yesterday, and an address she'd had memorized for a long time and had never used. The stairwell door at the far end of the level opened. Emily started her car. The stairwell door was still swinging on its return arc when Emily pulled out of the parking space. She didn't gun it. That was the thing about training. It killed the instinct to panic move, which was the instinct most likely to get you caught or hurt. She drove at a normal pace down the ramp toward level 2, one hand on the wheel, eyes on the mirror. The man from the stairwell was on foot. Foot was slow. She had geometry on her side as long as she didn't do anything that made her memorable. In the mirror, she caught him, briefly, through the gap between parked cars. He was moving fast but not running, looking. He hadn't seen her car yet. Level 1. Ticket gate. She fed the ticket, waited the 4 seconds it took for the arm to rise, pulled through. Normal. A woman leaving a parking structure after a long day. Nothing to look at. She turned left onto Kavanaugh Street and merged into traffic. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. She could feel it, that particular register of physical response that sits just below adrenaline overload, where the body is alert without being stupid. She'd spent years in that register. She knew how to work inside it. She drove 3 blocks, turned right again, pulled into a loading zone, and sat for 90 seconds watching her mirrors. Nobody turned in behind her. No gray sedan. She let out a breath. Not relief. Relief was premature. Just pressure regulation. Her phone screen lit up. Delgado. "I got your email," Delgado said before Emily could speak. Her voice had a quality Emily hadn't heard in it before. Tight and fast, like a person who has opened something and can't close it again. "Emily, what is this?" "It's what it looks like. This is..." A pause, the sound of papers, or maybe pages. "This is call records. These are Victor Paulson's phone records from the morning after Meridian Street. The first number is registered to the CAPD Records Division. Second is the Harmon County District Attorney's Deputy Office. Third..." I can read the numbers, Delgado said. The third one. Registered to a private legal services firm. The one that called Mara Solano 2 weeks after the incident and told her she had no standing. Silence. Victor Paulson called the legal firm that intimidated your witness, Delgado said, the morning after, before charges were even filed against Nate. Another silence, longer. Emily could hear Delgado processing, not emotionally, but structurally, the way a lawyer processes, mapping consequences and timelines and what they meant for what came next. How did you get his phone records? I didn't subpoena them, Emily said. They came to me. From who? Someone who had more access to this case than either of us knew. She watched a delivery truck pull out of the loading zone ahead of her. It doesn't matter how they came to me. They're clean. The sourcing is documented. Forward them to the DA referral. Emily, Delgado's voice had changed. Lower, careful. If Victor Paulson finds out you have these, he already knows. She thought of the man in the gray sedan, the stairwell door. He sent someone to the parking structure. Nobody followed me out, but that call from Briggs wasn't a goodwill gesture. He knows what I have. A beat. Are you safe? For now. She looked at the mirror again, clean. Send the files, Delgado. Tonight, not tomorrow. She ended the call before Delgado could ask anything else, because the answers would have taken time she didn't have, and because there was one more call she needed to make first. She scrolled to a name she'd added to her contacts 3 hours ago and hadn't expected to use this fast. Thatcher picked up on the second ring. The third email address, Emily said. The one I forwarded the files to. That was yours. A pause. I wondered if you'd figure that out. You were in that courthouse for more than a different matter, weren't you? It wasn't a question. Thatcher apparently recognized that, because he didn't bother answering it directly. Victor Paulson's development group has a federal contract dispute currently under DOJ review, he said, part of which involves allegations of evidence interference in a separate civil case 18 months ago. When his son's name came up in a new criminal matter, one involving a veteran, it generated a flag. A pause. I was asked to observe quietly. And the parking structure. I saw Reyes get out of the car. He's a private investigator Paulson's used before. He's not dangerous in the way you might mean. He's not going to shoot anyone in a parking structure in broad daylight. But he collects things. Information. He would have wanted to know what you had. Emily thought about the thumb drive. About the 4 seconds between pulling out of the space and the gate arm rising. I sent the files, she said. I know. I received them 4 minutes ago. Another pause, and this one had a different texture. Emily. The call records. Where did those actually come from? She looked out the windshield. The city was going orange in the late light, the particular shade of late afternoon that made everything look like it was about to become something else. Someone who was watching this case before I was, she said. Someone who couldn't surface the information through official channels without exposure. They put it somewhere I could find it. She paused. I think you know who. A longer silence. The DA's referral opens a formal investigation, Thatcher said. With these files, that investigation will move quickly. Paulson will know that. His response will be to make it complicated for everyone who touched this case. Emily started her car again. I know. I'm not a civilian, Colonel. No, Thatcher said. You're not. She pulled back into traffic and drove north toward Kessler Regional. She had 6 missed calls from the hospital and 37 hours of no sleep behind her and a thumb drive in her bag that now contained copies of documents that had made a powerful man reach for a phone within the last 2 hours. She would deal with each of those things in order. That was the only way to deal with anything. But the ER at Kessler Regional at 6:40 in the evening had the particular chaos of shift overlap. Day staff finishing their documentation, night staff coming on and getting briefed, the waiting room at capacity with the steady accumulation of everything that could go wrong in a city between noon and dark. Emily walked in through the staff entrance and made it approximately 14 steps before Priya appeared from behind the nurse's station like she'd been waiting. You look terrible, Priya said. I'm aware. The Alvarez kid from this morning. She's stable. Surgical team put a drain in at noon. She's talking. Emily let that land in the place she'd kept sealed all day. The 7-year-old, talking. Good, she said, and it came out rougher than she intended. Priya looked at her with the specific assessment of a charge nurse who has seen colleagues run past their limits enough times to recognize the signs. You need to go home. I know. Hartwell. Priya lowered her voice. There's a man waiting in the consultation room. He's been here 40 minutes. He says he's from the hospital administration, and he needs to speak to you before your next shift. Emily stopped. Administration, she said. Deputy COO Gareth Wills. Priya's expression was careful, professional, but her eyes said something else. The specific caution of a person who has already read the room and is trying to give someone a heads up without saying anything she can't unsay. He said it wasn't urgent, but he's been waiting 40 minutes. Emily looked at the consultation room door at the end of the hall. Frosted glass. The shape of a man visible through it, sitting with his elbows on the table. She thought about the call from Briggs, about Reyes in the parking structure, about the speed with which a man like Victor Paulson, confronted with a formal DA referral, would begin looking for levers. Kessler Regional had 2 of Victor Paulson's development group buildings in its facility expansion pipeline. She had not known that this morning. She had looked it up in the parking structure while she waited for the elevator. Tell him I'll be in shortly, Emily said. She went to her locker first, took off the jacket, folded it, put it inside. Washed her hands at the sink in the hallway bathroom and looked at her face in the mirror for a few seconds. She looked like someone who had been awake for 37 hours. She looked specifically like someone who was going to walk into that consultation room and hear something she wasn't going to like, and who needed to decide right now whether she was going to react to it or respond to it. Reaction was fast. Response was useful. She walked to the consultation room and opened the door. Gareth Wills was mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of someone whose job required it, rather than someone who particularly cared, with the tired face of a man who'd had a bad afternoon and expected the evening to be worse. He stood when she came in. Ms. Hartwell, thank you for making time. Of course. She sat down across from him. Didn't offer pleasantries, didn't perform. He sat back down, organized himself. I'll be direct with you. Please. The hospital received a call today from a legal representative. He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. Regarding your involvement in a criminal proceeding in Harmon County. The caller expressed concern about a member of our clinical staff providing testimony that included, their words, irregularly sourced documentation. Emily looked at him. They also raised questions, Wills continued, not quite meeting her eyes, about whether your attendance at court proceedings during what is technically your recovery time between shifts represents a conflict of interest with your employment obligations. It doesn't, Emily said. I understand that, however, Mr. Wills, her voice was even. I testified in a criminal proceeding as a medical expert witness, which is a legally recognized professional role. I did so during my own time, outside scheduled shift hours. The documentation I submitted was sourced through legitimate channels and entered into federal court record. That's the totality of what happened. She looked at him directly. Is the hospital asking me to stop taking expert witness work? Wills opened the folder, closed it again without looking at it. The hospital's position is that, because if the hospital is asking me to stop, I'd need that in writing. And I'd need to understand whether that instruction is coming from a clinical rationale or from a concern about a specific external business relationship. The air in the room changed. Wills looked at her for the first time. Really looked. Not the managed eye contact of a bureaucratic conversation, but the involuntary look of a person who has underestimated the terrain. He was recalibrating. She could see it. Nobody is asking you to stop anything, he said carefully. Then I'm not sure what we're doing here. He closed the folder, set his hands on it. I want you to understand that the hospital takes its staff's professional standing seriously. If there is anything that might create difficulty for members of our clinical team, we want to be aware of it. I appreciate that. Emily stood. If I become aware of any clinical or professional concern, I'll bring it to your attention immediately. She moved toward the door. I'm going home to sleep now. I'll be back on shift at 6 a.m. She had her hand on the doorframe when Wills said. The caller also mentioned that the woman from last night's ER, the pediatric patient. Emily turned around. Wills had the expression of a man who had decided to say a thing and already regretted it. They suggested that your documentation from that case might benefit from a second review, given the extended hours and the question of clinical fatigue. Emily looked at him for 5 full seconds. The Alvarez child, she said. Flat, no inflection. Who is currently stable in the PICU because of the decisions made during her care this morning. It was only a suggestion. Are you opening a clinical review of my care decisions from this morning? No. He said it quickly. No, we are not. Good. She held his gaze until she was certain they understood each other. Because if someone is using a 7-year-old's case file as a pressure mechanism, that's something the hospital's legal team would need to know about, along with the state licensing board, and the DA's office, which I happen to have spoken to today. Wills said nothing. His face had gone the color of old paper. Emily walked out. The parking lot was dark by the time she reached her car. She sat in it for a moment without starting it. The city outside the lot was making its usual sounds. Distant traffic, a siren somewhere north of downtown, the particular white noise of a place that didn't stop. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Different from Briggs's number. Different area code. She stared at it for 3 rings. Answered. Silence. Then a young woman's voice, careful, like someone stepping across ice. Is this Emily Hartwell? Yes. My name is Mara Solano. A pause. You called my patient liaison office. I signed the consent form. Another pause. I testified today. Not in person. They used my written statement. Ms. Delgado called me an hour ago and said the verdict came in. It did, Emily said. Not guilty on all counts. A sound on the line. Not a word. Just breath. Released. I wanted to thank you, Mara said. I know that probably sounds, you don't need to thank me. You signed the form. You let them use your statement. That took something. It took 4 months? Mara's voice broke slightly on the last word, then steadied. I kept thinking someone was going to help, and then nobody did. And I thought maybe I was wrong about what happened, but I wasn't wrong. You weren't wrong, Emily said. A silence. The city noise. The sound of someone 23 years old who had been carrying something alone for 4 months, finally being able to set it down for 10 seconds. They called me again today, Mara said. Different number, different person. Not a lawyer this time. She paused. They said that they thought I should know that the nurse who helped me was about to have a serious problem at her job. Emily went very still. Did they say anything else? She said. They said, Mara stopped, then quietly. They said I should think carefully about whether I wanted to be involved in anything further, because things were going to get complicated for the people around this case. A beat. I think they meant it as a warning about you. Emily looked out the windshield. The parking lot lights were on now, casting the flat orange light of every hospital parking lot everywhere. Normal, institutional, completely ordinary. Mara, she said, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Okay. The knife. The one Gareth Paulson had outside the service exit. Did anyone else see it besides you and Nate Rourke? A pause. Shorter than Emily expected. Yes, Mara said. Emily's hand tightened on the phone. Who? There was a man across the street. I didn't know who he was at the time. He was standing by a car and he had his phone out. I thought he was on a call, but then I saw the screen light up different, like he was recording. Yes. Mara's voice was careful again, back on the ice. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't know if he'd want to be involved. And I didn't know his name and I was scared. And then after the legal warning, do you think you'd recognize him? I already know who he is, Mara said. Emily waited. He came to the restaurant a week after, during the lunch shift. He sat alone. He left a big tip and his business card on the table. Mara paused. I still have it. The parking lot, the orange lights, Emily's own reflection faint in the windshield glass. What's his name? She said. Mara told her. Emily recognized it. She recognized it because she'd heard it 4 months ago in a context that had seemed unrelated to any of this, and for 3 seconds she sat with that recognition and what it meant, what it connected, what it unlocked, what it was going to change in the next 24 hours for Victor Paulson and everyone in his orbit. Then she started her car. She needed to sleep. She needed 4 hours minimum, because without that she'd be useless. And tomorrow was going to require everything she had. But first she needed to call Thatcher, because the man whose name Mara Solano had just given her, the one who had watched the Meridian Street incident from across the street and recorded it, was not a civilian, and his name was in the classified section of Emily Hartwell's own service record. She called Thatcher before she left the parking lot. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting. Daniel Carr, she said. 3 seconds of silence, the kind that wasn't empty. Where did you hear that name? Thatcher said. He was across the street from Meridian the night it happened. He recorded it. He left his business card at Mara Solano's restaurant a week later. Emily watched a nurse cross the parking lot 20 yards ahead of her, head down, moving fast in the cold. He's in my service record, Section 7, the classified annex. He's listed as an intelligence liaison attached to the unit for the last 4 months of my deployment. Another silence. Longer. Carr left the liaison role 8 months after you were medically separated, Thatcher said. He went private. Consulting work. A pause. He's been doing contract intelligence work for corporate clients for the past 3 years. Including Victor Paulson. I don't know that. But you could find out. Emily. His voice had shifted, not softer, but more careful. The voice of someone choosing words with purpose. If Carr was on Meridian Street that night and recorded what happened, that footage exists somewhere. And if he's been working for Paulson, then Paulson has had the footage this entire time, Emily said. The footage that shows exactly what happened. The footage that would have cleared Nate Rourke in the first 48 hours. She let that sit. He buried it. We don't know Carr gave it to him. But then why did Carr leave his card for Mara? He wanted her to know he was there. He wanted her to have a way to reach him. Emily thought about that, about what a person does when they're holding something they can't surface through official channels. The same thing that had happened with the phone records. He was trying to give someone a thread to pull. Thatcher was quiet for a moment. Then, where are you right now? Hospital parking lot. Go home. Get some sleep. Don't contact Carr directly. A pause. I'll make some calls tonight. Thatcher. I know, he said. I know what this means. Give me until morning. She drove home. It took 22 minutes. She ate half a bowl of leftover rice standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment she might not be able to reverse. She set her alarm for 5 a.m. She was asleep before she'd finished the thought that she should probably shower first. 4 hours and 11 minutes later, her phone went off. Not the alarm. A call. 4:26 a.m., Thatcher. She answered before the second ring, already sitting up, the way you answer calls in the middle of the night when you've spent years in environments where middle-of-the-night calls mean something specific. Carr wants to meet, Thatcher said. His terms. This morning, before you go to the hospital. He says he has the original footage and he's ready to hand over the chain of custody. Emily was already standing. Why now? Because the DA referral went active at midnight. He found out an hour ago. A pause. And because he's been trying to get out from under this for 3 months and he just got handed a door. Where? Thatcher gave her an address. Downtown, a coffee place that opened at 5. She knew the street, not the shop. He'll be alone? He says so. Do you believe him? I believe he's scared enough to be honest right now, Thatcher said, which is its own kind of reliable. Emily looked at the clock. She looked at her jacket on the chair where she'd put it before she slept, the patch facing up in the dark. She thought about Nate Rourke going home last night, actually going home, walking out of the courthouse building a free man, and about Mara Solano sitting with a business card for 3 months, wondering if it mattered. "I'll be there," she said. The coffee shop was narrow and warm and smelled like roasted beans and old wood, the kind of place that had been on the same corner for 20 years and had no intention of changing. At 5:15 in the morning, it had 4 customers, 2 construction workers at the counter, a woman working on a laptop in the back, and a man sitting at the window table with a cup he hadn't touched. Daniel Carr was 51 years old. He had the build of someone who had been fit for a long time and was still mostly there, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from intelligence work. Not military stillness, which was disciplined and outward-facing, but the turned-inward stillness of someone accustomed to watching rooms rather than commanding them. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He had circles under his eyes that matched hers. He saw her come in. He didn't stand. She sat down across from him, didn't order anything, looked at him. "You look different," he said. "So do you. You were 24 when I was attached to the unit." I know how old I was. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His hands were not steady, which was information. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this for 3 months," he said. "I looked up Delgado's office twice. Didn't go in either time." "But you left Mara Solano your card. I needed someone to find the thread without it coming from me directly. I couldn't surface it through—" He stopped, reorganized. "Paulson's legal team has a non-disclosure agreement that covers my consulting work for his group. If I break it, he sues me into the ground, and everything I hand over gets contested as tainted." He looked at her. "But if a witness finds me, if I'm contacted through legitimate channels as a potential witness to an incident I actually witnessed, the NDA has a standard carve-out for legally compelled testimony." Emily looked at him. "You needed someone to subpoena you. I needed someone to give me a reason to testify that Paulson's lawyers couldn't void." He held her gaze. "You were in the courthouse. I heard about the morning session, the records you submitted, Thatcher showing up. I called Thatcher at 7 last night." "You've been in contact with Thatcher?" "He reached out to me 6 weeks ago about the DOJ matter. I gave him context I could give without breaking the NDA." Carr shifted his weight. "When the DA referral went active last night, the NDA became a lot less useful to Victor Paulson and a lot more dangerous to me. Because if I'm sitting on footage that's material to a federal investigation and I haven't disclosed it, you become part of the obstruction," Emily said. "Yes." She looked at the window. The street outside was just starting to get light. That thin pre-dawn gray that made everything look provisional. A delivery truck. A jogger. The city waking up one layer at a time. "Show me," she said. Carr reached into his jacket and produced a phone. He placed it on the table between them, screen up, and pressed play. The footage was 47 seconds long. Shot from across the street, slightly elevated. He'd been standing near a raised planter, she could tell from the angle. The restaurant's service exit was visible. The alley beside it. The lighting was poor but workable, the kind of quality that was enough. She watched it twice. She didn't speak during either viewing. In 47 seconds, the footage showed everything. The exit door opening, Mara Solano stepping out, the 3 men following her into the alley. The moment one of them, Gareth Paulson, visible enough, produced the knife. And then Nate Rourke, coming around the corner, assessing, moving, the hold, the fall. And then Nate on his knees applying direct pressure to the neck wound, talking to the man, keeping him present, waiting with his hands visible when the first patrol car's lights appeared at the end of the block. 47 seconds. 4 months of a young man's life. Emily pushed the phone back across the table. "I'll contact Delgado at 7, she said. "She'll have her investigator reach you before 9. You tell them exactly what you told me. The NDA, the carve-out, the footage chain of custody, all of it on record." She stood up. "And Carr?" He looked up at her. "The phone records. The ones that showed up in my access point 3 weeks ago." She kept her voice even. "That was you." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Paulson called you that morning, didn't he?" she said. "The morning after Meridian." A pause. very small. He called to tell me the footage needed to not exist. And you didn't delete it? No, Carr said. I didn't. Emily looked at him for a moment, not with warmth. He had sat on this for 3 months while Nate Rourke went through arraignment and pretrial hearings and the slow dismantling of his reputation. That was real, and it had costs she wasn't going to minimize. But she also knew what it meant to be inside a system that punished honesty, and to be looking for a way out that didn't destroy everything you had. She'd lived in that particular geography herself. Make the call, she said. Get it on record. She walked out into the early morning and drove to Kessler Regional. The 6 a.m. shift started, the way all shifts started, with a handoff, a patient board, and the immediate sense that whatever you'd planned was probably not what the next 12 hours had in mind. Emily worked. That was what she did. A hypertensive crisis in Bay 2, a respiratory distress case in 3, a construction worker with a degloving injury on his right hand that required 40 minutes of careful irrigation, and a conversation with the on-call plastics resident who was 28 years old and visibly nervous and needed someone to walk him through the first steps without making him feel like he needed walking through. She did the work. She let it organize her. It was the most reliable thing she knew. At 9:43, Delgado texted, "Car's in, footage authenticated. Filing emergency motion to submit supplemental evidence. Judge is Forsyth. He's not pushing back." At 10:18, DA's office contacted. "This is moving fast. Call me when you have a break." Emily didn't have a break until 11:30, and by then Delgado had 3 more updates waiting. She called from the break room with the door closed and a coffee she hadn't touched going cold on the table. Paulson's attorneys filed an injunction this morning to block the DA referral, Delgado said. It was denied inside 2 hours. On what grounds? Forsyth denied it, personally. A pause that had something dry in it. He cited the newly submitted evidence and wrote, and I'm quoting here, that the court has an independent obligation to the integrity of proceedings in which evidence suppression may have occurred. For Forsyth, that's practically a confession. Emily drank the cold coffee. It was bad. She didn't care. What about the footage? Authenticated and submitted. The DA's investigative team has a copy. Carr gave a recorded statement this morning. The NDA carve-out held. Paulson's lawyers challenged it and lost before lunch. Delgado's voice had the compressed energy of someone managing multiple moving things simultaneously. Gareth Paulson's attorney contacted my office at 11 a.m. They're discussing cooperation. Cooperation with who? With everyone. DA, DOJ, the civil case review. A pause. He's 26 years old, and his father's lawyers just spent the morning making very clear that their primary obligation is to Victor, not to him. Emily thought about Gareth Paulson in that courtroom yesterday. The comfortable certainty in the way he'd been sitting, the arms crossed, the sense of a young man who had never been in a room that wasn't already arranged in his favor. And then the expression on his face when the foreperson stood up. Some lessons arrived slowly. Some arrived all at once. "Nate," she said, "I spoke to him this morning. He's okay. He's going to be okay." Delgado's voice shifted briefly into something less professional. "He asked about you." Emily didn't say anything to that. "Emily, the footage is going to be on the news tonight. Paulson's involvement, the suppression, the intimidation of Mara Solano, all of it. The DA's office is doing a press statement at 4 p.m. A pause. "Your name is going to be in it." "I know. Is that a problem?" Emily looked at the break room wall. Someone had pinned a staff scheduling grid to it, covered in handwritten shifts and traded hours, and the particular organized disorder of a department that never fully stopped. Her name was on it. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. "It's fine," she said. The 4 p.m. press statement ran 12 minutes. Emily watched it on her phone in a supply closet between patients because the break room had 4 people in it, and she didn't want to watch it with an audience. The DA, a compact woman named Hargrove, who spoke with the precise economy of someone who had learned that every unnecessary word was a liability, laid out the timeline without drama. The Meridian Street incident, the assault on Mara Solano, Nate Rourke's intervention, The footage that had existed since that night. The phone calls Victor Paulson had made the following morning. The legal warning delivered to Mara Solano. The evidence that had not been disclosed to the defense. She did not use the word conspiracy. She didn't need to. The sequence of events assembled its own argument. She mentioned Emily's name once, briefly, in the context of the medical records submission. She mentioned Carr as a cooperating witness. She mentioned Mara Solano with the particular care of someone aware that a 23-year-old woman was going to have her name in the news and deserved to have it treated with some dignity. Then she said that Victor Paulson had been contacted by federal investigators that afternoon and asked to make himself available for questioning. That was the part that mattered. Emily put her phone back in her pocket and went back to work. By 6 p.m., the hospital hallways had the particular charged quality of a place where people have been watching their phones between tasks. 2 nurses asked Emily if she'd seen the news. She said yes and kept moving. One of the ER attendings, a skeptical, overworked man named Dr. Ferris, who had never once in 4 years asked Emily a personal question, stopped her near the medication station and said, "That was a good thing you did," in the specific tone of a person who does not give compliments easily and means it when they do. She nodded. That was all. Wills, the deputy COO, appeared at the ER entrance at 6:45. He didn't approach her directly. She saw him standing near the administrative corridor, looking in her direction, with the expression of a man who had spent the afternoon revising his position. She looked back at him once. He looked away first. She didn't feel triumphant about that. She felt tired. There was a difference. At 7:12, Priya appeared at her shoulder. "There's someone in the lobby," she said. "He says he's not here for medical care. He says he'll wait." "Who?" "Nate Rourke." Emily finished the note she was writing, put the chart back, washed her hands. He was in the far corner of the lobby, away from the patient's seating. He'd cleaned up since the courthouse, different clothes, hair combed, but he had the same quality of contained tension that she'd noticed in the courtroom, the kind that doesn't fully release just because the immediate situation has resolved. He stood when he saw her. "You don't have to be here," Emily said. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know what to say in the courthouse yesterday. There wasn't... The bailiff was right there, and I didn't... Nate," he stopped. "You went home," she said. That's what mattered. He looked at his hands for a moment, those corpsman's hands, steady, then back up. "I heard the press statement, about the footage, about what Paulson did." A pause. "All that time I kept thinking, maybe I misread it. Maybe I was wrong about what I saw. Maybe it was the adrenaline." He stopped. "But I wasn't wrong." "No," Emily said. "You weren't. Did you know? When you took the case, did you know what you were going to find?" She thought about that honestly. "I knew something was wrong with the evidence. I didn't know how far it went." He nodded slowly, processed that. "What happens now, to Paulson?" "That's not mine to answer. The DA has what they need. The DOJ has the federal contract angle. It'll take time." She looked at him. "It won't be clean. People like him have resources, but the footage exists now. It's in the record. That doesn't go away." He was quiet for a moment. "What about you?" he said. "The news said your name." "I know. Is that going to cause problems with the classified stuff?" Emily almost smiled. "I've been in worse situations." He looked like he wanted to say something else. Didn't. What he said instead was simple and direct. The way people speak when they mean something and don't want the packaging to get in the way. "Thank you." She held his gaze. "Take care of yourself, Rourke." He nodded once, walked out. She watched the lobby doors close behind him and stood there for a moment in the antiseptic hum of the ER entrance, with the sound of monitors and voices and the everyday machinery of a hospital around her. Then she went back to work. Victor Paulson was taken in for federal questioning at 8:47 p.m. The information came to Emily through 3 separate text messages within 4 minutes. Delgado, Thatcher, and Priya, who had apparently been monitoring the news on her tablet at the nurse's station. The image that led the 11 o'clock broadcast showed Paulson walking from his downtown office building into a waiting vehicle flanked by federal agents. He was dressed well. His face was arranged into the specific neutrality of a man who has decided that his expression is the last thing he still controls. Gareth Paulson's cooperation agreement was confirmed the following morning. He was 26 years old, and his father's attorneys had made the calculation clear. He gave a full statement. All of it. Meridian Street, the phone calls, the legal warning to Mara Solano, the instruction to Carr to suppress the footage, the coordination with the contact inside the CAPD Records Division to ensure the supplemental report stayed buried. That last part opened something new. An internal affairs review of the Callaway Area Police Department's Records Division, cross-referenced with the DA's investigation, which cross-referenced with the DOJ's existing federal contract review, which had threads going back 18 months to the civil case Thatcher had mentioned in the parking lot. It was not clean. Emily had told Nate it wouldn't be. Investigations of this scale were slow and iterative and generated as much noise as signal, but the footage was in the record. The call logs were in the record. Carr's testimony was in the record. Mara Solano's statement was in the record. Those things didn't move. 3 days after the verdict, Emily was on her second consecutive 12-hour shift. The department was short-staffed, which it always was, and she'd said yes when Priya asked because she always said yes when Priya asked, when she got a call from a number she recognized now. The footage aired again last night, Thatcher said. 3 networks. I saw. The JSOC training position is still available, in case the situation with your hospital administration has made things complicated. Emily was standing in the corridor outside Bay 4, where a 63-year-old man with a STEMI was being prepped for transfer to the cath lab. She had 4 minutes before she needed to be somewhere else. Wills hasn't said anything since the press statement, she said. That's not the same as the situation being resolved. No, but it's the situation I have right now. She watched the transfer team move down the corridor with the coordinated speed of people who know exactly how many minutes they have. Why are you keeping tabs on me, Colonel? A pause. Because someone should have, Thatcher said. A long time ago. That landed in a place she'd sealed off for 5 years, and she let it, briefly, before she put it back where it lived. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'll think about it. That's more than you gave me last time. She was already moving. I have a patient. She ended the call and walked into Bay 4 and put everything else down and did the work. On the 4th day, the Harmon County Bar Association announced a formal review of Judge Forsyth's conduct in the Rourke proceedings, specifically his treatment of a witness and the conduct of the morning session. The announcement was 3 paragraphs. The last one noted that Forsyth had voluntarily submitted a statement to the reviewing committee, which was the institutional equivalent of arriving early to your own reckoning. On the 5th day, 2 of Victor Paulson's development projects in Callaway were placed under administrative hold by the City Planning Commission pending review of the approval processes that had been used to fast-track them. One of those projects was the Kessler Regional Facility expansion. Emily found out about the Kessler project from Priya, who had found out from Wills, who apparently looked like a man discovering what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a decision he'd made in a consultation room 5 days ago. She didn't go looking for him. She didn't need to. What she needed was to get through the shift, and then the next one, and figure out somewhere in the margins of that what came next. She was documenting a laceration repair at the nurse's station when her phone buzzed with a message from Delgado. Mara Solano has retained civil counsel. Paulson's team reached out about a settlement this morning. First number they offered was insultingly low. Her attorney said no, they're going to try again. Emily typed back, good. Delgado. Also, someone from the state nursing board called my office today. They wanted to confirm that the clinical review Wills mentioned, the one about the pediatric case, was never formally opened. Emily stared at that. They'd received an anonymous complaint, Delgado continued. Filed 3 days ago. Before the press statement, someone tried to open a review of your care decisions from the Alvarez case, and the board is reaching out to confirm the hospital's position. Emily set the phone down. She looked at the patient board. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the ordinary busy machinery of an ER on a Thursday afternoon. The gurneys, the monitors, the 6 different conversations happening at once. And she thought about a 7-year-old in the PICU upstairs who was talking and would probably go home by the end of the week. Someone had filed a complaint with the state nursing board about Emily's care decisions on the night she'd saved that child's life. Filed it 3 days ago. After the verdict. After the press statement. After Victor Paulson had been contacted by federal investigators. She picked the phone back up. "Who filed it?" she typed. Delgado's answer came back in under a minute. The name on the complaint wasn't Paulson. It wasn't Briggs or Reyes or anyone else she'd identified in the past 5 days. It was a name she hadn't seen before, a name attached to a private medical consulting firm based in a city 300 miles from Callaway. She looked at it. She ran it through what she knew. It took her 40 seconds to find the connection, the firm's registered agent, a name buried 2 layers down in its corporate filings, the kind of name that was designed to be hard to find. Gareth Paulson's cooperation agreement had covered everything he knew about his father's operations. But Victor Paulson had not been operating alone. The name in the corporate filing was Raymond Holt. Emily sat with it for 60 seconds, not frozen, just processing, the way you process information that changes the shape of everything around it. Holt. She hadn't heard that name in 5 days of this, hadn't seen it in any of the documents she'd pulled, hadn't encountered it in Carr's testimony or Gareth Paulson's cooperation statement, or any thread she'd followed to any end. But she knew it. She knew it from a context so disconnected from courtrooms and parking structures and filing complaints with the state nursing board that for a moment her brain resisted the connection the way it resists something that doesn't fit the established pattern of a room. Raymond Holt had been the administrative director of the military liaison office that had processed her medical separation paperwork 5 years ago. She had met him exactly once, across a table in a government building, signing documents she hadn't fully read because she'd been on enough pain medication that reading required more concentration than she had. He had been efficient, professionally sympathetic, and completely forgettable, except she had remembered him. She always remembered people in rooms. It was wiring she couldn't turn off. She pulled up the corporate registration for the medical consulting firm. Holt was listed as registered agent, which was 1 layer. The firm's primary client disclosures, filed as part of a state contractor registration she found in 4 minutes of searching, listed Victor Paulson's development group as a contracted client for regulatory affairs consultation. The contract had started 14 months ago, long before Meridian Street. She forwarded everything to Thatcher and called him immediately after. "Holt," she said when he picked up. "Raymond Holt. He processed my separation papers." A silence that told her Thatcher either already knew the name or was moving fast to place it. "He left the liaison office 2 years ago," Thatcher said. "Private sector. I know the firm. They do regulatory navigation work for clients with federal contract exposure. They're not—" He stopped. Started again. "They're not unusual in that space. Lots of former government people do that work." "He filed a complaint with the state nursing board about my care decisions on a pediatric case," Emily said. 3 days ago, after the press statement, after Paulson was contacted by investigators. The silence this time was different in quality. "A medical consulting firm run by a former government liaison filed a professional complaint against a nurse," Thatcher said slowly, "about a case that has nothing to do with Paulson or Meridian Street. Using a connection to Paulson that exists in filings 2 levels deep. That's—" He stopped again. She could hear him thinking, "That's not Paulson. Paulson swings a hammer. That's someone who understands institutional systems. Someone who knows that a nursing board complaint, even a frivolous one, opens a process that creates problems, review periods, documentation demands, potential license holds if it escalates. It's a slow mechanism," Emily said, "designed to not look like retaliation. Designed to look like an unrelated professional concern that just happens to arrive after you've become inconvenient." Thatcher paused. "Who else knew you'd be in that courthouse before you walked in?" She thought about it. The missed calls from the hospital. Priya knowing because the court date was on the schedule. Delgado's office, Nate's defense team, and anyone who had been watching this case from the beginning, which apparently included people she hadn't known were watching. Holt had access to my separation file, she said. My employment history would have been in that file. My certifications, my license number, my current employer. She looked at the patient board on the wall across from the nurse's station. He's had everything he needed to do this for 5 years. Emily. Thatcher's voice was careful and direct. The nursing board complaint needs to go to Delgado tonight. It already has. And the connection to Paulson's firm. Also sent. A breath. Not quite a sigh. Something more like acknowledgement. You know what this means for the investigation scope. It means Gareth Paulson's cooperation statement isn't complete, she said, because Gareth only knew what his father told him, and his father kept Holt separate. She thought about that architecture, the deliberate distance, the corporate layering, the way a man with resources builds systems specifically so that when one part fails, the failure is contained. Paulson outsourced the institutional pressure, kept it away from his direct operations. Which means the DA needs to know about Holt before they finish building the case, Thatcher said. If they close the Paulson investigation without pulling that thread, Holt walks and the mechanism stays in place. I know, Emily said. She ended the call, looked at the board again. Bay 4 had been cleared and reset, already occupied by a new patient, a 17-year-old with a suspected appendicitis, brought in by a mother who hadn't let go of her daughter's hand since they arrived. The regular ongoing business of an emergency department, people coming in broken or scared or both. The work that waited regardless of what else was happening. She went to Bay 4 and did her job. And when she had 20 minutes at the end of the shift, she sat at the nurse's station and wrote a detailed timeline. Holt's name, the corporate filing, the complaint date, the connection to Paulson's firm, the dates, and the sequence. And she sent it to Delgado, to Thatcher, and to the federal court records inbox she'd used 5 days ago. Then she went home and slept for 7 hours without interruption, which was more than she'd slept in one stretch in a week. The nursing board complaint was formally withdrawn 9 days later. Emily found out from Delgado, who had spent those 9 days doing the particular kind of methodical legal work that doesn't generate press conferences or footage on the evening news, but produces results anyway. Documentation requests, regulatory correspondence, a carefully written letter to the board's review committee that laid out the timeline of the complaint's filing relative to the ongoing criminal investigation and asked the committee to consider the context in which it had been submitted. The board's review committee considered the context. They withdrew the complaint. They also flagged it for internal review, which was the institutional equivalent of noting that something smelled wrong without committing to finding out what it was. That was fine. The flag was enough for now. What Delgado didn't tell her until the following morning was that the DA's investigation had formally expanded to include Raymond Holt and his firm 48 hours before the board withdrawal. Thatcher had apparently made calls, the kind of calls that moved through a specific network Emily understood in theory, but had never directly benefited from, the network of people who had been in the dark places and came out with an understanding of each other that didn't require explanation or documentation. Holt had a lawyer by noon on the day the investigation scope was announced. His lawyer's first statement was that his client had acted in a professional advisory capacity for a legitimate business client and had filed the nursing complaint in good faith based on information provided to him. It was a good opening position. It was also, Delgado said on the phone, the opening position of a man who had not yet been shown the specific evidence that connected the complaint filing date to a phone call from Paulson's personal number 41 minutes prior. Carr had that call in his records too. He'd handed over everything. But the press conference Emily hadn't known about until the morning it happened was held outside the Harmon County Federal Courthouse on a Tuesday, 11 days after the verdict. The DA's office, the Federal Liaison's office, and the city's Public Integrity Unit jointly announced charges against Victor Paulson, 3 counts of evidence tampering, 2 of witness intimidation, and 1 of conspiracy to obstruct a criminal proceeding. Charges against Holt were announced separately. 1 count of filing a fraudulent professional complaint as part of an obstructive scheme, which carried penalties Emily hadn't known existed until she looked them up. She watched the press conference on her phone in the break room during her lunch break. Hargrove spoke first. Same economy of language as before. Same flat precision. Then a federal representative. Then the Public Integrity Unit Director, a soft-spoken woman who described the Paulson operation in terms that were, Emily thought, more accurate than most. Not a conspiracy of grand ambition, but a systematic accumulation of small pressures applied to people who had fewer resources to resist them. A 23-year-old waitress, a 26-year-old veteran, a nurse who showed up to court covered in blood after a 36-hour shift. None of those people had been chosen by accident. They'd been chosen because they looked, from the outside, like people who could be managed. That was the thing about power that operated that way. It was always most confident right before it was wrong. Gareth Paulson's image was in the footage that played on every channel that night. Not from the press conference, from Meridian Street, the 47 seconds. The knife visible in his hand for 11 of them. His face, caught at the restaurant's exterior light, showing the particular expression of a young man who has never once considered that what he's doing is wrong, because wrong had always been something that happened to other people. He was 26 years old. He would spend the next several years learning what accountability felt like from the inside. Emily didn't feel satisfaction about that exactly. She felt something more complicated. The recognition that consequence and punishment were not the same thing, and that what had been broken on Meridian Street and in the months that followed couldn't be fully repaired by any legal outcome. Mara Solano would be okay. She was resilient, and she had people around her, and she'd retained good counsel, and she was 23 years old with a lot of time still ahead. But she'd spent 4 months being told she had no standing, and that didn't just go away when a verdict came in. Nate Rourke would be okay too. He was back in Callaway, working. She'd heard that from Delgado, secondhand. He hadn't called. She hadn't expected him to. What had passed between them in that lobby was sufficient. Some things didn't need to be continued. Forsyth's Bar Association review concluded 2 weeks after the verdict. The committee's findings were not punitive. He was a 19-year judge with no prior disciplinary record, and the review had been triggered by conduct in a single session rather than a pattern. But the findings were unambiguous. The committee determined that his treatment of Emily on the stand had fallen below the standard of professional conduct expected of the bench, and that his commentary regarding her insignia had created an atmosphere that was prejudicial to the proceedings. The finding was published in the bar's quarterly bulletin. 4 paragraphs. Professional language, the kind of thing that would live in a record without being dramatic about it. Forsyth issued a public statement the same day. It was 4 sentences. The last one said, "I regret the manner in which I addressed the witness and the atmosphere that conduct created in my courtroom." Emily read it once. It was not an apology that gave her anything she needed because she hadn't needed one. She had walked back into that courtroom and done her job. That was already done. What she felt reading it was less about herself than about Mara Solano, who had been 23 years old and terrified when she walked out of that service exit, and who had received no public acknowledgement from any institutional actor until the DA's press conference. Forsyth's 4 sentences were in a legal bulletin. Mara's courage had produced a verdict and an investigation and an expansion of charges and would eventually produce a civil settlement that would be the difference between financial stability and a very precarious decade. That math wasn't fair, but it was the math, and pretending otherwise didn't serve anyone. 3 weeks after the verdict, Emily was finishing the documentation on a sepsis case in Bay 7 when Priya appeared at her shoulder with the specific expression she used when something had happened that she wasn't sure how to classify. "Thatcher's here," Priya said. Emily looked up. "In the lobby. He said he'd wait." She finished the note, put the chart back, washed her hands, walked to the lobby. Thatcher was standing near the window, not sitting, standing, with his coat on, looking out at the hospital entrance. He turned when he heard her. "You could have called," Emily said. "I was in the building," he said. Different floor, liaison meeting with the hospital's Veterans Affairs Coordinator. A pause. "I thought I'd stop." She looked at him. He had the look of a person who has prepared something and is now deciding how to say it. She'd seen that look on enough people to know it was better to let them get to it rather than shortcutting. "The JSOC training position," he said. "I told you it was available. It's still available. But I want to be accurate with you about what it actually is because I wasn't fully specific before." "Go ahead." "It's not a classroom position. It's not administrative. He held her gaze. It's a curriculum development role combined with field assessment. We send the faculty into training environments, not just lecture halls. You'd be evaluating real-world scenarios, working directly with medics who are 6 months out from deployment. A pause. It would require a clearance reinstatement. That's doable, given your existing file. But it would take time, and it would mean my file isn't classified anymore, Emily said. Not entirely. The operational details stay sealed. But your service record, your commendations, those would be formally acknowledged. Unclassified. She looked at the lobby window. The hospital entrance. 2 paramedics coming through the automatic doors with a gurney, moving fast. The particular controlled urgency that meant something real was coming in. I need to go, she said. I know. Give me 2 weeks, she said. Ask me again in 2 weeks. Thatcher looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. 2 weeks. She was already moving toward the incoming gurney. A man, mid-40s, pale and sweating, hand pressed to his chest. She assessed him in the time it took to cover the distance, and she was talking to the paramedic before she'd fully arrived, her voice level and direct and asking exactly the right questions in exactly the right order. Behind her, Thatcher watched. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The 2 weeks passed, the way 2 weeks always pass in an ER. In increments, not in narrative. One shift, then another. A 16-year-old with a broken wrist and a story that didn't match the injury and the careful, difficult conversation that followed. A 48-year-old man with a pulmonary embolism who had been about to drive himself to work when his daughter had insisted on the ER and had, by doing so, given him roughly 30 more years. The Alvarez girl went home on a Thursday morning, and her mother left a card at the nurse's station that Emily read once and put in her locker and didn't throw away. The Paulson case moved through its institutional process. Slowly, the way these things always move, not with the clean momentum of a story, but with the grinding procedural reality of a legal system that was not built for speed. Victor Paulson entered a not guilty plea and retained 4 attorneys. The DOJ's federal contract investigation expanded into 3 additional Paulson business entities. Holt negotiated. The terms leaked, which they always did, and the terms were not comfortable for him. Cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge, the kind of arrangement that preserved the mechanism of justice while acknowledging the practical reality that the full mechanism takes years. Gareth Paulson's cooperation agreement held. He testified in the pre-trial proceedings, twice, in sessions that were not public but whose summaries entered the record. His attorney described him in press statements as a young man who had made serious mistakes and was committed to accountability. Emily thought about Nate Rourke's expression in the courthouse lobby and said nothing. Mara Solano settled her civil case on a Wednesday afternoon. The number was not public. Her attorney's statement was 3 sentences, and the last one said that her client was satisfied and was moving forward. Emily texted Delgado. Good. Delgado texted back. She asked me to pass something along, and then, in a separate message, she said to tell you that she still thinks about the fact that you called her directly, that you were the first person who did. Emily put her phone down and didn't pick it up for an hour. Thatcher called on the 15th day. 1 day late, which was either an accident or him giving her space. She suspected the latter. 2 weeks, he said. I know. She was in her car, end of shift, parked in the hospital lot. The same lot where she'd watched a stairwell door swing open 3 weeks ago. It looked entirely ordinary in the evening light, just a parking structure, just rows of cars, just the fluorescent fixtures buzzing overhead. I've been thinking about it. And? She looked at the hospital entrance, the automatic doors, the paramedic bay. The lights of the ER visible through the glass, the particular quality of light that means something is always happening inside. I have a condition, she said. Tell me. I keep my position here. Part-time if necessary, but I keep it. I'm not choosing between the training role and the ER. She paused. I know that's not typical. It's not typical, Thatcher agreed, but it's not impossible. We'd need to work out the scheduling. I'm not flexible on it. I didn't expect you to be. A pause. Is that your only condition? She thought about it, actually thought about it. Not performing consideration, but doing it. She thought about what it had cost her to keep the two things separate for 5 years. The jacket in the locker, the classified file, the carefully maintained distance between who she'd been and what she did every day. She had built that distance deliberately and for reasons that made sense at the time, and she didn't regret it. But she was 34 years old, and the separation had served its purpose, and she was tired of the weight of maintaining it. "My record," she said, "the commendations. I want them visible. I don't need a ceremony. I don't need it in the news. But I want it in a file somewhere that isn't classified, somewhere that exists in the ordinary world, so that it existed." She paused. "So that what I did over there is real in the same way that my nursing license is real." A silence. Different in quality from his other silences. Not calculating, not cautious. Something quieter. "That's already done," Thatcher said. She stopped. "The court record from the Rourke proceedings references your service and your commendations. That's a public document now. It already exists in the ordinary world." Another pause. "It existed the moment Forsyth decided to ask about your patch." Emily sat in her car in the parking lot and looked at the hospital lights and thought about a Tuesday morning in a courthouse, and a judge who had pointed at her like she was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe, and how the thing he'd thought was a costume had turned out to be the only thing in that room that couldn't be manufactured or purchased or strategically managed. "Okay," she said. "Okay to the position? Okay to all of it." She could hear Thatcher settle. Not physically, but the quality of the call changed. The tension of someone who has been asking for something and has just been given it. "I'll send you the paperwork this week," he said. "The clearance reinstatement will take 8 to 10 weeks. During that time, we can start the curriculum planning remotely." A pause. "Emily." "Yeah. For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much from where you're sitting, what you did in that courtroom wasn't just about Rourke. The footage, the records, the Holt connection. That's the kind of careful, patient work that systems are supposed to do and mostly don't. You did it without a title or a mandate or anyone telling you it was your job." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was looking at the automatic doors again. A woman coming through them with a child on her hip, moving fast. The particular fear walk of a parent whose child is sick and who needs someone inside those doors to fix it. "It was my job," Emily said. "I just do it in different rooms." She said goodnight and ended the call. Sat for another 30 seconds. Then she got out of the car and walked back through the automatic doors, because the shift she'd just ended didn't matter. Priya had texted 20 minutes ago that they were short by 1 and could she stay, and Emily had already known before she checked her phone what her answer was going to be. So, the thing about being underestimated is that it never fully stops. Emily understood that. Had understood it for years in the way you understand things that have been repeatedly demonstrated rather than theoretically proposed. There would be another courtroom, or another administrator's consultation room, or another version of someone looking at a tired woman in a battered jacket and deciding that the jacket told them everything they needed to know. That was just true. It was going to keep being true. What was also true was the 47 seconds of footage. The intake record for Mara Solano that had been sitting in a hospital database for 4 months. The 7-year-old in the PICU who was going to grow up. The chain of custody documents that had survived a parking structure and a phone call from Briggs, and a compliance meeting and a fraudulent nursing board complaint, and every other mechanism deployed to make them disappear. The things that were true stayed true whether or not the room acknowledged them. Emily had spent 5 years understanding that at a level most people didn't have to. The jacket didn't need the room to know what it was. Neither did she. But there was something, and she was honest enough to admit it, alone in her car 3 weeks ago and now in the plain fluorescent light of the ER hallway with Priya handing her a chart and the patient board already filling up again. There was something in being seen. Not validated, not vindicated, not applauded, just seen. Mara Solano saying you were the first person who called. Nate Rourke with his hands over his face for 1 second in the moment the verdict came in. Thatcher standing at attention in a federal courtroom before a gallery full of people who had just finished laughing. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo anything. It was just real. The way the commendations in the public court record were now real. The way the Alvarez girl going home was real. Real things accumulated. That was what she believed. Not that justice was inevitable, or that systems corrected themselves, or that the good outcome was the guaranteed one. She had seen too much to believe any of that. But real things accumulated. Evidence stayed in the record. Footage survived. The people who told Mara Solano she had no legal standing had now encountered the limits of that strategy in a way they would not be able to unencounter. You built the record. You stayed in the room. You told the truth precisely and completely and let the weight of it do what weight does over time. That was not a simple thing. It was not a comfortable thing. It required the specific, unglamorous endurance of someone who has decided that the alternative, walking away, going quiet, accepting the shape of things as they are, costs more than the fight. Emily Hartwell had calculated that cost a long time ago, in a medical processing office with separation papers in front of her and enough pain medication in her system to make reading difficult. She had made her decision not dramatically but functionally, the way she made all her decisions. What's the next right thing to do? And can I still do it? And if yes, then do it. The answer had been yes then. It was still yes now. Priya handed her the chart. Bed 3, chest pain, male, 57, preliminary vitals on the board. You good? Priya said. Yeah, Emily said. She pulled the curtain back and walked in and introduced herself and got to work. Outside the hospital, the city did what cities do. Continued, indifferent, full of people who didn't know and wouldn't know what had happened in a courthouse 3 weeks ago, who were managing their own versions of being dismissed and overlooked and told their standing was insufficient. Some of them would find a thread to pull. Some of them would find the right person in the right room at the right moment. Some of them would not, and that was the part that didn't resolve, the part that sat at the bottom of every story like sediment. The people who didn't have the records, the people who couldn't find Delgado, the people for whom no one showed up in the courthouse hallway. That was why you kept doing it. Not because every case resolved, because some of them did, and the ones that did mattered to specific people with specific names who were going to live their lives differently because of it. Mara Solano, who had signed a consent form and let her statement into a federal record and would spend the rest of her life knowing she had done that. Nate Rourke, who had been trained to help people and had done exactly that on a dark street and had been made to answer for it, and who would carry both the act and the vindication forward into whatever came next. A 7-year-old named Rosie Alvarez, who didn't know and wouldn't know and would just grow up. Emily worked through the rest of the shift. When it ended, she drove home on the same route she always drove, down Kavanaugh's, across the bridge, north on Merchant Street toward the apartment that had exactly enough room for one person who was rarely home. She ate, she showered, she slept. In the morning, she put on her jacket, same patch, facing out. She drove to Kessler Regional. She walked in through the staff entrance. She got to work.